Hi, folks. We're just going live with the broadcast so we'll wait a few seconds for the technology to catch up and get all our participants going. So get started in about a minute here. So let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ed Cervone from Thomas College. I'd like to welcome you to the Education Innovators Speaker Series. The Speaker Series is an opportunity to hear from regional and national thought leaders on topics of innovation in the education field. The series is brought to you through a partnership between Educate Maine, the Education Action Forum of Maine, and the Center for Innovation in Education at Thomas College. Today, we are pleased to present Jason Swanson, the Director of Strategic Foresight at KnowledgeWorks. Jason is going to be joined by two Maine educators, Heather Whitaker, the Alternative Education Teacher at Gorham Middle School and 2020 Maine State Teacher of the Year, and Matt Druitt-Card, the Director of Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment at MSAD 46 in Penobscot County. Their full bios can be found via a link in the chat. The presentations will be followed by Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your screen in the function bar, there is a Q&A function. Please feel free to post your questions throughout the talk. The last 20 minutes will be devoted to this. Please note, this is being recorded and will be available for distribution after today's event. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Jason Swanson. Jason, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ed. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for everybody, to everybody that's tuning in this afternoon. So I'm going to do a bit of a slide share, so excuse me for just a moment. Get us teed up. So for the next 20 minutes, I want to share a little bit about our research around the future of learning, as well as present a light touch framework that you all might be able to apply in your own thinking about education futures in Maine or wherever your learning community might be. So the first thing that I want to cover is really this notion that nothing I'm about to share is a prediction. So as futurists, we're really fond of saying that we are in the business of depiction, not prediction. So it's impossible to know the long-term future, and that's for a variety of reasons. But mainly it's just because the farther out that we get into the future, the more variables we're encountering. And what you see here, it's a foresight teaching tool. It's something called a cone of plausibility that's used to illustrate this. So we like to think that we're making certain assumptions about change and depicting a range of futures, what we call the 3 Ps. So the first P would be possible futures. It's basically all the white in this screen. It's saying that anything can happen, although it's probably not likely. I like to think that in my own life that this applies with the lens of I could win the lottery, right? It's possible, it's not likely. The next P is probable or plausible futures. Those are futures that exist within the limits of plausibility of this cone. They're futures that are, more plausible in nature, as the name would dictate. And then the third P is my favorite P, preferred futures, or visions. These are where we would like to go. So with that said, the twin pandemics, both COVID-19, the pandemic of 1619, have created an environment for educators and really for society that is rife with uncertainty. So those near-term futures that would have a smaller amount of uncertainty, really those bounds of plausibility have been blown out. And they're causing us to ask some really critical questions right now about how we meet learners' needs in the near term and how we might begin to sow seeds or create pockets of the future as we work to kind of navigate this sort of uncertainty. Now, in talking about change, in talking about the future, change really comes in two flavors. It comes in inbound change. This is change that happens to us. Certainly COVID-19 would be considered inbound change, would be considered discontinuous change. It's an event. There's also continuous forms of change. These would be trend lines, patterns of change, things like the ubiquity of artificial intelligence, the continued progress towards things like personalized forms of learning. Now, the other side of the coin is something we call outbound change. This is a change that we create through our own agency. It's one of the things that we like to talk about at KnowledgeWorks, so this idea that the future is not a fixed point, that it's ours to create, and that really it symbols to the world where our values lie as a learning community, at the personal level, at the organizational level, and really largely dictates where we're going to put our efforts in favor of that preferred future or that vision in terms of making that future come to life. So with that said, I said I would give you a framework, a light touch framework to think about these things. And what you see here, it's something called a 3 horizons framework. It's popular from a management side of things. It's also very popular in terms of the foresight side of things in terms of a standalone methodology. But what this is really looking at are transition phases based on degrees of strategic fit. And when I start to talk about the future after this slide, this is the lens that I'm applying. So right now we are in the midst of a deep transition in education, and indeed through most of our social systems. And with that period of transition, accelerated by COVID-19 and the pandemic of 16-19, we're seeing a decline of many of the services and offerings that we used to provide within the context of education. So last academic year, for instance, we saw a rash of waivers, and we saw really the decline of strategic fit around state testing. As such, we've entered into this transition period, right? We've engaged in the world's largest experiment in distance and online learning. So we see that second horizon beginning to curve up. But the pandemic and this disruption won't last forever. Eventually, we'll get to that post-pandemic future. And that's where that third horizon comes in. That third horizon is something I like to call our visionary futures. They come back to that third P, that vision. So in asking where we want to go, we also have to interrogate our long-standing efforts at meeting learners' needs, our most recent efforts in that blue curve, the transition phase, in meeting learners' needs within this disruption, and begin to interrogate what about our actions in this current moment are serving to create those pockets of the future. What seeds are we planting now that will bear fruit on our way to that visionary horizon? So as part of that, I want to make use of the chat box right now, because in keeping with this idea with the framework, I'm not here to tell you about the future, but I want to kind of guide us in this exploration together. So using that chat box, I want you to describe your vision for the future of learning, that third horizon, when we get to that post-pandemic future. And I want you to do it with big, bold adjectives, right? Not sort of transactional or mechanistic visions, but things like, I believe learning will be fluid. It's going to be rooted in justice and equity and love. It's going to be relevant and engaging. It might speak to our students' timeless needs. And again, this is a time to be bold. This is where it signals to our stakeholders in Maine, our community members, that future that we want to drive towards, not a vision statement. So as you begin to populate that, I want to really begin to tag team at 3 levels here, really kind of talking about the future. One, from a standpoint of a broad trajectory of change, which is what you see here. So whenever you see all caps on the sign, this is what I'm getting at. And then I want to follow that up with a specific futures-oriented sort of design question. Really, this is an artifact from the future or a provocation. So the first of which is as we begin to look at trajectories of change, and this is really speaking at the level of policy. Something that accelerated with the murder of George Floyd and the large-scale recognition of things like systemic oppression and institutional racism is the need within our learning communities, driven largely by parents and largely by the community, to reconceptualize what it means to have shared accountability. Now, from our standpoint, this is a broad move where educational accountability really has to move from its current top-down structures and test-driven systems to a far more expansive view of school quality that's both co-created and co-facilitated by communities. So as policymakers engage in thinking about how they might shape the future, this is an invitation and a call driven by a large-scale societal trend to give community members and the most marginalized among us a real seat at the table in crafting legislation. Now, from a future standpoint, the ask here in one specific instance of this would be, what if we had community advisory boards that would provide direct input around educational policy? These inclusive boards would consist of learners, their families, and community members. They would guide school districts and their boards in analyzing the potential impacts of proposed policies, recommending viable approaches, and articulating hyper-local narratives of success. So this is a very decentralized mode of creating policy, supported by a long-term trend for which the federal government has stepped back, passed a lot of the educational policy decisions back to the state, and kind of drilling down even further, really, as I mentioned, accelerated by the current pandemic. So the next piece is really looking at a broader trend that's existing around classroom and school structures. So communities all across the country, Maine is certainly no stranger to this, but there has been a long-tail trend towards personalizing learning. This is no secret if you're an education stakeholder in the audience, but it's a trend that we can't ignore, especially as we're thinking about sort of more plausible education futures, certainly as we're thinking about visionary futures. But this idea that we've got to enable culturally responsive personalized learning is indeed supported by those trend lines. And it really asks school districts and state departments of education to begin to collaborate closely with learners and families. You'll notice that this idea of collaboration is going to be a trend line throughout this talk. But it really begins to ask that this level of collaboration at its core begins to create multiple pathways for learners to view their unique identities as assets for learning rather than hindrances. As we start to look at ideas for the future, we get at this notion that what if each student had a real-world learning portfolio, in that this would apply to every student, and hear me when I say every, and not just gifted students. And they would have opportunities to engage in robust, interest-driven, project-based learning throughout the school year. Students would receive support in nurturing their interests and would demonstrate what they've learned through relevant, performance-based assessments and tangible evidence for growth. So this idea and this provocation also turns the idea of assessment on its ear just a little bit as we're looking through relevancy, performance-based assessments, and creating tangible evidence for that a student indeed has grown academically. So last but not least, because we've covered policy, we've covered classroom practices, I'd like to turn our attention to educator roles. So there's a pressing need to take a fresh look at educator roles, pathways, and supports for educators as well. And that this current moment provides the opportunity to think anew about who serves as an educator and to extend educator pathways and supports. So systems of learning need to recognize the many caring adults who contribute to learners' journeys and the need to implement new educator roles designed to increase support for learners as well as staff. As part of this massive experiment in distance and virtual learning, we've seen that role, at least unofficially, of who constitutes an educator radically expand to include parents, caregivers, to fold in more of the out-of-school learning time providers in very real ways. So there's also a pressing need here to create new education preparation pathways and encourage Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people to enter education, while at the same time developing professional cultures that encourage them to stay in the field. Lastly, we really need ongoing professional development to focus its emphasis and incorporate personalized learning content and delivery for our educators. So again, rooting us back into the future, what would it look like making certain assumptions about the trend lines I just said around educator roles? Well, it begins with asking the question, right? So what if in this instance, each school had a full-time director of relationships? So this would be an administrative level position, which would focus on building relationships in support of learners' holistic health and well-being. This person would really work to foster a sense of belonging and would help learners and educators build social capital as part of their education journey. So rather than piling up more and more responsibility on our educators, like this, ask a question: what would happen if we would dramatically expand and diversify educator roles themselves? So looking across really kind of this broad trajectory of change, there are indeed some overarching implications we need to consider for whatever future of learning that we're looking at. The first of which is that it's time to question assumptions. Right now, we've seen massive amounts of improvisational innovation happening at speed, calling into question the very assumption that many in society hold that education can be slow to change. We need to continue to question those assumptions, questioning how we measure success, the assumptions about what school is for. Might school need to continue on a learning platform in a building? So there's a lot that we need to air out and begin to question as we move beyond this current moment of time into this post-pandemic future. There's a strong trend line driving social justice as a key priority for learning. In the education change-making, when we're beginning to talk about the future of learning, must consider social justice and equity as key design components rather than an afterthought or an addition. The third bullet point here is that this notion that the future is everyone's business. And I want to applaud the organizers of this event, because we need as many mechanisms as possible to collaboratively and continuously talk about images of the future. We need radically participatory methods to talk about what we want and what we value in terms of the future of learning. And then lastly, we have a pressing need for new narratives that can enable new solutions. Those narratives might and should include what might the purpose of education be, narratives around how we think about and define things like learner engagement, and so on. So that's it for me. I want to thank everyone. My contact information is on the page. Please reach out. I'm always happy to talk about education futures and change and hear what's going on in your neighborhoods. So I want to take this moment now and I'm going to turn to Heather and Matt. It is indeed my honor to welcome them onto the stage, and I am going to go to the back of the house and thank you all for your time.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Jason.
Hey all, yeah, Heather and I discussed this, and we're going to kind of go at this together in a little bit because we want to have it more of a conversation. And so I've encouraged Heather to interrupt me, and Heather's encouraged me to interrupt her. So we might be a little bit of that going back and forth. I want to start though with this kind of a recognition for everyone that these last 8 or so months have been scary, weird, awful, inspiring, and a whole lot of what just happened and what is going to happen and and we've gone from a crisis management mode to a planning for something mode to a now we're doing the something mode, and we're all in this kind of world of ish, and it's been a whole lot of ish for a while, especially this last 8 months, and I think we need to recognize that. And once we recognize that, it's also important to recognize something else. It's easy for all of us who are going through all this, and let's be honest, we're all going through and facing some significant trauma through all of this situation. It's going to be easy and expected for a lot of us to just kind of fall back into this idea of what's normal, of what always has been, of just doing what we've always done. And that's totally reasonable and understanding. When we started talking about doing this and was asked to do this thing, the word innovation series kept coming up. And at this time, right now, if you bring up the word innovation to folks and be innovative, they're like, how can I possibly put this into my brain at the moment? How can I possibly think of doing something new, brand new, that's never been thought of? And that is something that I would like to challenge us to rethink. I like to challenge us to rethink about what innovation actually means. I don't think it necessarily needs to mean that we're creating something that's never been heard of, thought of, done, or seen before. In fact, I look at it as, well, let's look at what we already have and let's just twist it. Look at it from a slightly different angle. So if you're on 360 degrees on a circle and you're starting at 0, go 2 degrees to the right. You're not making a huge change there, but when you start spreading it out, the end result could be very different. That's where innovation can really come from. And what we have here with this whole mess of what we've had for the last 8 months or so is, I liken back to the quote from Winston Churchill to never let a good crisis go to waste. And we do have opportunities here to really ask some really hard questions about things that we already have going and things that we already do, and those things that we tend to go back to normal. And when we ask these questions, one of the things that we do, and the things that grounds me with everything that I do, is I have to find myself in what do I believe, and what is it that I really believe. And beliefs and ideas are different. Ideas are fixed, or I'm sorry, ideas are not fixed. Ideas can be changeable. Ideas can be adjusted, but beliefs are fixed. So, for example, I have a firm belief in how grading structures should be. That they should be very clear. That they should be that there shouldn't be a whole lot of different levels. Like a 0 to 100 scale is very hard to really get a clear amount of feedback to an individual. And I think that should be focused on feedback mostly, etc. Now, if we want to use a 4-point scale, great. The labels on the 4-point scale, I think those can be changed. You know, years ago we thought that exceeds expectations was good language, and then a couple of years ago, Tom Gusky comes out and writes, yeah, exceeds expectations actually is probably not the best thing to write. So maybe we should think about our language. Great, the language can change, but the general belief of what that level is really doesn't change, and why we're doing it that way. So as we're thinking about this, this new world that we're in, what is it that we really believe? I've been struck, and I've been reminded constantly of the line in education that's been around for a little while now, that time is the variable, but learning should be the constant. And we've talked about that. We've heard a lot of things about that over the course of the years. And this pandemic, this crisis learning, and now distance learning, and all of everyone hybrid, that has absolutely brought that into question. It has brought that to the front. And what is it that we really believe? And one of the things this pandemic is doing is it's testing our resolve in these things. So it's going to say to us, do you really believe that the learning is the constant? And I say this because one of the things that I hear a lot of conversation about, and we're dealing with ourselves, is attendance. When you have distance learners, when you have kids at home, my 2 kids, they're living the remote learning environment. Well, how do you measure attendance in a distance learning environment? That's an incredibly difficult question, especially when you look at our statutes. because our statutes say it's time-based. We have this many days during the course of the year. In order to a day for it to count, you have to mean this many hours. So it's all time-based. So I think this is an opportunity that what we can do as a structure and a system is to start asking those questions about, what does attendance really mean? Does it really mean butts in seats? Is that really what it matters for attendance? Or is it a level of engagement? And if it's engagement, what does engagement mean? And these are the questions that we're struggling with and we're trying to figure out on our end in the classroom. We don't have a good answer yet because we're struggling like everyone else is. But these are also the questions that we're pushing to make sure that we ask. Another one that we're looking at is, I mentioned grading a few minutes ago. And it's, a lot of folks believe heavily in grading, that grading and evaluating is an essential component of school. Well, I wonder to what extent is it really? Because if you really think about it, who actually needs the grades the most? And that's going to be juniors and seniors in going to high school, because they're the ones who are sending out their transcripts to go into colleges or post-secondary work, etc. So we build up this entire grading system for that purpose. I'm not saying it's not valuable at that point, but why are we doing all this grading? What is the purpose of it all? And a lot of teachers hang on to it. They want to do it. They believe it's a great source of feedback. Okay, great. One of the things we're doing is, when we in the crisis, when we went in the crisis mode back in the spring, is in our teacher evaluation system. We said, you know what? Let's get rid of the number evaluative grading system, because it's not fair at this point. We're all gonna do something that's brand new things. And the steering committee said, yep, let's get rid of it. Let's not bother with it this year. Great, we're just gonna focus on the feedback. Well, what if we continue that for this year? And what if we really focused on the feedback to giving the educators from the instructional leaders in our building and district? What if we really gave them just that level of feedback? What would we then be modeling? Would we be modeling in a way to potentially then adjust and change the entire way we do grading and reporting in our district, in our school? And that's some of the things that we are exploring, and we are, we're some waters that we're testing in all of this.
And Matt, can I jump in on that for a second?
Please.
Because one conversation we were having with some colleagues is that in that type of evaluation system, right now we know right now relationships with students and our families are the most important thing. It is what we need to focus on to allow our students and families to transition back to school in a healthy and meaningful way, and that we're not going to be able to make progress with our learning unless we have those relationships first. However, if teachers are going to be evaluated based on the assessment scores of their students, it puts pressure on teachers, and it creates conflict in the relationship versus content. And we want our educators to be relationship-based first and then your content. But if our evaluation system is based on solely the academic progress of their students, it really creates a conundrum for educators. And the pandemic has really taught us that the students that are the most disengaged need the relationship the most. And that's how, I loved, Jason, what you said. I really connected to that director of relationship, having a director of relationship within your building. But first and foremost, we need to be the director of relationships within our classroom. And when we can do that within our classrooms, we're able to discover the students that are struggling the most and do some real deep reflection in a way that we try not to be defensive about our practices. What is it they're struggling to engage in? Why are they struggling to engage in that? And then what can we do differently to meet their needs? And that takes, it's hard because we pour our love and our heart and passion into everything that we do in the classroom. And when something isn't working with a student, you can get defensive, but this is now is the time more than ever to step back and say, this isn't about me. And I just need to do something to shift so that our students can be more engaged.
Oh, you said it beautifully. Because I've talked about this a little bit before, but you can't, if we're solely focused on the academics, which we have been for so long, if that's the sense of normalcy we go back to, in a hybrid or a remote or any kind of situation, the relationship is the most important thing you can have. The connection between the teacher and the student, that relationship is the most important thing, because if you don't set that up right away and you don't maintain that and build on that, the academics won't come.
And I'm just concerned that when we get into that post-pandemic world, Matt, and we get a vaccine and we want to go back to normal because normal feels safe, that we will lose the message to our educators to spend the time building the relationships, enhancing the relationships, and then repairing the relationships, because we know that we have struggles, and that, you know, the classroom is a very fluid place that's often like a family, and that when there is conflict, we then need to spend time resolving that conflict and then repairing those relationships. And it's a year-long journey. It's not just something that we do at the beginning of the year with team building activities. And we have the messaging from Augusta and the commissioner that relationships are the heart of everything that we do. And so I hope that momentum will be able to carry forward in a post-pandemic world.
I do too.
And that goes into the social justice. You know, you can't have social justice if you don't have relationships and empathy. And you can't have you know, identity work. If students don't feel safe in a classroom, then it's going to be really hard for them to do any work on who are they and who do I want to be as I move into the future.
Yep. So I've talked a little about what I wanted to talk about with innovation and with in terms of how we are dealing with things, how we're challenging it, and I'm continuing to walk that fine line of not overwhelming everybody with ideas, but also to be respectful of, you know, let's use this as an opportunity. Let's use some of the things that we have here, the time that we have here to ask these questions, to make these incredibly hard shifts that would normally take 10 to 15 years. One of the conversations we've had in my district for a long time is, what if we got rid of the word grade in front of grade level and we just put level? What if we just did that? Would that have kind of an impact on, instead of saying, well, no, you're in second grade or third grade or fifth grade. Well, no, you're at level 3, like in a video game, and now you're at level 4, now you're at level 5. Do we have now the ability to kind of make that shift if this is something we really wanted to do? Because in a pandemic world of everyone's quote unquote has this learning loss, which is I can't stand that idea. Lost for who? Lost for what? We're all in the same place, and we made up the benchmarks. We can remake them. So we have opportunities to make these things really better, to really focus on the kids themselves and on their needs, and on how to build a structure more than any time we have before to advance, to change things. I'm kind of mumbling now, but
no, you're not mumbling
so
at all. So I got thinking. So Matt, do you have more educators getting outside right now than in the past?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
It's been great to see.
Yeah, and I love it. And so this is something that I hope can also gain momentum. We know that students are more engaged when they are involved in experiential learning. And so I look at the outdoor classroom sort of in 3 tiers. So right now we have you know, students and teachers that are taking mask breaks, and that serves an incredible purpose. But what if next year, rather than mask breaks, they were brain breaks or movement breaks, and we still continue to bring our students outside? So that's just the first level. Let's move. We need to shake this out a little bit and get outside for 5 or 10 minutes. And then the next level is increasing our comfort level with teaching our content in an outdoor classroom. So you're not changing the content, but you're at least using an outdoor space, the fresh air, and just the natural environment around you is just such a mood lifter, particularly when we start looking at mental health needs as the pandemic continues, and just the growing concern of students' mental health. Just getting outside outside does provide a boost in mood. And Matt, you have young kids at home. We know when our kids are tantruming, if we can just like take them outside for 5 minutes, it can really be
Or
a
just
mood
send them out.
shifter. Yeah, or send them out, exactly, whatever, get outside. But then that third level, which to me is like my teaching nirvana, it's the place that I'm always striving to go, but I don't know if I'm ever going to get there, is that everything I teach is done through the natural world. And when I say the natural world, it doesn't have to be in the woods, even though that's where I would love to always have my students. But any concept that I'm teaching with my standards and in my curriculum, I'm using the community around me to teach those skills. And like you said, that's why it's so important that all of these community partners are coming to the table, because to have that happen, we really need to have those relationships with our businesses and our nonprofits and everyone in the community around us. And that can be really like a lofty thought. Oh my gosh, like let's just get out in the community and do all of our learning. But I have found as an alternative education teacher, if I just do little steps at a time, how can I take the Pythagorean theorem out into the garden? Or I need to teach about water quality. How can I partner with the Portland Water District and make this happen? And if we take each one of our units and infuse more outdoor education and experiential learning into it, I'm a believer that that really increases the engagement and the overall health and wellness of our students.
See, what I love about what you're doing there is you're not doing anything quote unquote groundbreaking. You're not doing anything that's like
hey, come
so
on.
out. No, you know what I mean. But
I'm
so like just like this like idea that no one ever possibly thought of. I'm pretty sure that everywhere in Maine has outdoors. I'm fairly certain that that's a thing that exists literally everywhere in Maine.
Right.
So all you did, what you're doing is you're just taking an idea and you're just shifting it a little bit. But the end result can be astronomically just more powerful, more engaging, deeper sets of learning, and you're just getting the better end results that you've always wanted to find.
Matt, share your 2% thing. I love that.
Oh,
That 2% at the beginning. You didn't do the full explanation. I love that.
I didn't. Okay, so all it is if you think about on a circle, if you're starting at 0, and that's where you are, those are what you normally do. If you just go 2 degrees or 5 degrees to one side or another, then it's not that big of a step. It's just a slight change at its base level. But as you go out from the end of the circle, the end line spreads further and further, and then your end point can be a very distant, very different place. And that's what I think the kind of innovation that really happens that has some significant impact. I don't want people to I don't want to completely tear down the schools and rebuild them and have them look completely different. No, because a lot of what we're doing is working.
Yeah.
A lot of what we do is work. A lot of what we always have done is worked. But there's also some things that haven't worked. I mean, right now we have kids in the distance learning environment who never thrived before, who are absolutely thriving in this environment. We have teachers in this environment who were struggling in that, but are thriving in a remote environment. So we're just going to throw all that out and go back because it's what we're used to?
I was thinking about how neat it would be if each school had one distance learning educator, so that could possibly be an offering for those students that are thriving in that setting. And then you would still be able to infuse social interactions and the mental health and the wellness and the SEL into that type of learning. And almost on the SEL piece is that the USDA just extended free meals, so universal meals for students in Maine through the end of the school year. And that this is a tremendous innovation in that all of our students can come to school without the stigma of participating in the free and reduced lunch program. And there's the stigma, or there's the families that don't qualify, and they are able to get food. And we know that Maine is the most food insecure state in New England, that we have 43% of our students when the pandemic started in Maine were eligible for free and reduced lunch. And if we could create some momentum so that next year students were able to go in and grab their breakfast and grab their lunch and get their nutritional needs met, then as educators, we would be able to study the impact on engagement and focus and behaviors. Hungry kids, every kid needs to eat. Like I think Matt, you and I were talking about being hangry, you know, and we need
Oh,
to
yeah.
we need to make sure that we're feeding our students. And what an amazing time to even extend this beyond the pandemic world.
I can't say enough about that. That's one of those little seemingly little things, but it has a huge impact. And those are the questions I hope we continue to ask. So
and I'm how are we on time wise? Because there's a lot of chats coming through.
Yeah.
Oh, one mark minute. Oh, we're over. Good. Okay.
Thanks, Heather and Matt. Would love to have Jason come back and transition to the question and answer phase. I'm Jason Judd, the Executive Director of Educate Maine, and excited to be here for this conversation and be part of this partnership. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to help transition some of these questions from the chat to our panelists, and please kind of keep them coming into the Q&A feature as part of this conversation. I want to start off with the first one, which is really about students, and I'm going to give this one to Heather to get us started. How can teachers advocate for students to have authentic voices, envisioning the future of our schools and education? So thinking about students' roles in this work. Would love to hear your thoughts, Heather.
So one thing we're actually doing at Gorham Middle School is our administrators have created an student advisory panel that meets weekly. And what this starts with is we have administrators that authentically want to hear from our student population. And they ask them questions about their learning and their experiences in school. And then they bring that back to us as educators. And they are advocating on the behalf of our student voice so that we can look at how to make teaching and learning better for them. So it really does start with your administrators, and then also as educators, every classroom teaching students about self-advocacy. How do you advocate? What are effective ways to advocate? How do you ask for help when you need it? And so we need to start it at this level, and then also make sure that our administration values the voice of our students.
Great, thanks. Matt or Jason, do you want to add on to that at all before we move on to the next question?
I +1 to everything Heather said. More specifically getting into visions for the future of learning. So once you have the culture of valuing student agency and student voice, the vision for learning is easy. Just ask them. They've got tons of ideas. I just transitioned from an hour-ish conversation with 3 students about their views for the future of learning. And I would add a third component to this. So if you truly are valuing student voice, choice, and largely agency as part of that conversation, whatever they develop for their visions, you need to put it out to the community in highly transparent ways and ask the community to respond back. Communication has to be a two-way proposition. It can't just be, what do you think? Okay, great. But that community piece, making the walls of the classroom as porous as possible, and are like fully publicly articulating these ideas, I would strongly advocate for that.
Great, thanks. And then I'll give this next one to Matt. It's about our students and something many of you have talked about on this conversation, which is about how do we serve students that are not in a stable home situation and don't have access to the same online resources and connectivity as part of the pandemic or after the pandemic subsides? So we'll start with
that's an enormous question. The district that I work in is very rural. It's the dense center of Maine, and so we have parts of our district that have literally no connectivity where they are. So how do you serve them in this particular way? And One of the things that when we first started going down this road 8 months or so ago is that when we do our planning for our kids, we have to think in terms of synchronous learning like this, asynchronous learning, but we also have to think of analog learning. We've got to think in ways to make sure that we can get to our students and connect with them in different ways. But like Heather was bringing up, the most important thing is the relationship and the connection. So if we can't necessarily get them on a Google Classroom or whatever, things like that, well, we have to make that relationship somehow really work. We have to figure out a way to do that, because if we don't, that other engagement or the other academic stuff, it's not going to happen, because they're not going to believe that they even have a say. They're not going to believe that they have a voice. They're not going to believe that anyone really cares about them. They're just being left out. So that where the relationship matters the most is paramount for in any of the situations. But I think that's one of the ways in which we have to start and then recheck and then recheck and always come back to.
Great. Heather or Jason, any additional comments to build on Matt's?
I think it also, it's that relentless energy that we need to have, that the students that are not engaging the most or have the least amount of equitable access to the resources, it's turning to our community to find out how we can support those learners and what resources they have that we can share with those students. And Matt, I really liked it on one of your podcasts, you were talking about, why does it need to be that they're checking in at 8 on the remote days? If they check in at 11 and it's on Google Classroom, or if it's via a text message or an email, or they turn in an assignment, that they're showing their presence and they're completing their work. And then that can be a way to measure engagement. Although, I mean, to measure engagement, that's a whole loaded, that's another whole hour. But at least
measuring attendance.
Yeah, attendance. Right.
That could be one of those things.
Right.
Sorry,
And so it's really getting creative, Jason, in the different ways. And right now, I mean, this isn't an option for everyone in every district. So I realize this, but I just find home visits to be incredibly powerful. And so if it's something that your district allows you to do, and whoever you need to bring, my home visits when my students are the most disengaged have been the piece that can turn things around for me. But I work with alternative learners, so it's different. It's a different, situation.
Great, thanks. Let's move on to the next question, and I'll have Jason get started on this one. How do we encourage systemic change versus change led only on the backs of our teachers? How can we advocate for a push for innovation across the board, so to speak?
Wow. Again, huge questions. So how do we scale change? And I would argue, well, what types of change are we advocating for? So I'm going to take the position of transformative shifts, right? And the first is this idea that the answer is in the question, is that it is everybody's business. It can't just be on one sole stakeholder group, can't be one organization. So it goes back to those 3 Ps, the first of which is, what is the community's vision? Not just the learning institution, not just the business sector, but together. What can we begin to envision that's possible? With shared vision, then we have to have shared buy-in. We need to engage in systemically interdependent partnerships. The work of transformation has to be built on the shoulders of partnerships. This is a multi-stakeholder proposition for any sort of change. And I think that begins to get at it, right? If you can imagine what a powerful force for transformation, just your 80 percentile parents might be. The parents you see at a soccer game that normally just say, you know what, things are good, you're doing well. But it comes down to, how can we envision and co-create these spaces and move them together rather than pushing them off on one individual organization, one stakeholder group. Lasting change, it won't get you there. So it has to be a mix of top down and bottom up, like synergistic efforts. I know that's not a lot of specifics, but what will drive change in your community will probably be different than what will drive change for me here in Western Pennsylvania. But at the core of it is that lasting recipe will have those elements that I've spoken to.
Great. Can I look to Heather or Matt if you want to share, your approach in terms of thinking about innovation in your roles and in your districts? What do you think it'll take here in our main communities?
Yeah, I got to go by. No, it's what I find fascinating about this question is that it was talking about encouraging systemic change instead of on the backs of teachers. Isn't that what it said? Right? And maybe this is wildly unpopular, but I think it's going to happen on the backs of the teachers. I think they're going to be the ones who are going to lead the way. And if us evil administrators did our jobs well, we'd get out of their way. And we would kind of let them lead that and show what we need to do. And then what we can then do is come around on the other end to provide the supports and then kind of help create parameters and keep people in that. So I think that any real historically successful governmental change, I mean, look at our nation and our constitutional republic that we have. The reason why that's done is because it's a we the people mentality. Real revolutions that are systemic change and happen and sustain because of a grassroots, people first driven community, like Jason was talking about, perspective. It can't be just a couple people in a room far removed make a decision and then everyone follows suit. So I think what we have to do is kind of look at what we have, where we are, and see how are our teachers, how are our educators responding to this moment, and then say from there, well, where might we be able to go in the future from it, and then help them to get there. Because to be honest, they're the ones who are going to do it. And they have been. You've seen what they've been doing the last few months. It's been incredible.
Well, I have to turn to Heather. She's got to weigh in here.
Yeah. So no, that's perfect, Matt, because you were triggering thinking, but also I am so distracted by the incredible comments in the chat, and now I just want to talk with everyone on the chat, like over coffee somewhere. So Tim H, you said exactly what I was going to say. As educators, we are so humble. However, we are undercutting ourselves and our students when we do not share powerful messages of success, what we're doing and how our students are being successful, particularly when we're being innovative. And that was so hard for me, Jason, when I shifted. I was 10 years as a traditional sixth grade teacher, and I'm now on my 10th year as an alternative education teacher. And I have experience with this because people didn't understand what alt ed was. And often when there's misunderstanding, there are judgments and labels. And I got the best advice from my former principal, Bob Riley, who's now retired. And he said, you need to expand your reach. You need to tell your story to as many people who will listen to you, because it will shift their thinking. And we have to do that as educators. We have to spread our powerful messages of positivity. And that is how we're going to create small bits of change that will all join forces.
Great.
Oh, Heather, that was brilliant. I just want to say one other quick thing on this topic, because this is I think what Heather brought up was so important, is that the sharing of ideas, and that's how we all get together and can really improve. What might be like just common sense and just whatever's like normal and just not a big deal for you could be someone else's game-changing moment. And so that's something to consider in this area where we can share information. We can really be a bigger community than we ever have been before. We can make that happen by doing things like we're doing right now, having this series of conversations, by getting involved in Twitter chats, by getting involved in other places to be able to share your ideas, to do something that is very hard for many educators, which is trying to push away our imposter syndrome, which is being like, no, what I do is valuable. What I do is worthy of being seen and shared, and other people might benefit from it, and then I can benefit from them. I think that's a really powerful thing, Heather, that you brought up, and thank you for bringing that up.
Great. So we've got probably time for 2 more questions. The next one is really connecting to partnership, and I'll look to Matt maybe to start this response first, which is about what's the most effective way, that a nonprofit or other community partner might be able to develop and share with schools their programming. Is it to reach out? Is it to email? Sort of what are the ways right now to connect with educators and be helpful if you're not in the school building specifically, but you want to help move some of these ideas forward? Any thoughts?
That's an incredibly difficult conversation. I'll speak a little bit selfishly for a moment. As a person who gets several hundred emails a day, emails don't work very well for me. But what does work well for me as an individual who's also out there on things like social media and things is seeing what you're doing, seeing how you're connecting with others, and seeing what it is that you and your product or your organization is doing. And if in connecting that way and engaging in a conversation in a similar place, like in a chat like this, or seeing you here in a chat thread or wherever it is, that's the stuff that for me, that has a lot of impact, a lot more than just like some canned email saying, hey, here's what I am, here's what we do. And okay, yeah, I get hundreds of those a day, but how do we make a connection? And also it is also though, I would say, finding some of those folks who are, those pioneers, those people who are stepping out really forward and making and celebrating them. I don't know.
And I would, Jason, I know I'm watching the time. I'll do 30 seconds because I could go on forever. So my alternative education program is diverse and rich because of the businesses and nonprofits that are willing to work with me. And so the first thing that I always say to people not in the education world that want to partner with school is, it's okay. We know you're not a teacher. Right? You're not a traditional teacher. I will help you. I will facilitate the conversation. I'll keep the conversation going. And that takes off a lot of pressure. And then, just letting nonprofits and businesses know that we need them to do this work, because it also gives students motivation and something to work towards, because they see something in themselves they see in that person out there. So it makes them see why education and why schooling is so important.
So coming from the nonprofit world, being the nonprofit representative, 100+1 to both of you here, in that we like to think that it begins with listening, right? And cultivating that relationship first, right? So the superpower would be listening, and then developing, holistically recommending something. We might find that what we have to offer is not what you need, right? And hopefully our bench is deep enough to then steer you in a different direction. That wouldn't be possible without having the relationship in place first.
Great, thank you. Well, I think our time is coming to an end, and I did want to offer a couple of closing thoughts. First, just want to thank the panelists, Jason Swanson, Matt Jewett-Card, and Heather Whitaker for joining us and being part of this great experiment through the partnership that we've built to talk about innovation and education here in Maine. And just know that this is the first of several conversations that we're going to be having over these next couple of months. And we need you folks to continue to be at the table, to continue to share your ideas. The first way you're going to do that is Catherine Johnston put a survey in the chat that we'd love for you to give us some feedback on today's conversation, as well as future topics that you'd like to go into more detail with that will help us plan the next couple of months. If there were some questions that we didn't get to today, it's fine for you to send them along to us. You can send them to jason@educatemaine.org. And I'll make sure we get them to the 3 panelists and get you those responses to be able to continue this conversation. Want to thank the partners for this series as well, Thomas College, the Education Action Forum of Maine, and the staff at Educate Maine. and just really appreciate you being with us today. So encourage everyone to fill out that quick Survey Monkey. It'll just take a couple of minutes to give us some great feedback so we can continue to have these conversations moving forward. And I hope that you'll take some of the ideas today and think about how they might work in your own communities. We're going to be following up with an email to everyone who's registered, and we're also going to provide a recording of this conversation so that you can share it with others and go back and hear more of the ideas that we talked about today. So appreciate everyone's time today, and enjoy the day.